On this edition of Crime Chronicles, I come to you from Wright Field on the south side of Chicago, the home of the Chicago White Sox. I'm taking in a game between the White Sox and the visiting Minnesota Twins. On this edition, we go back to 1919, talk about a not-so-glorious time in baseball history. It was a year that the White Sox threw the World Series to the Cincinnati Reds. The stadium where I am now is called Wright Field, also referred to as Guaranteed Wright Field. Until a few years ago, it was called the New Comiskey Park, and it's been the home of the White Sox for about 35 years now. But prior to the early 1990s, late 1980s, the White Sox played in a place called Comiskey Park, which was about 100 years old at the time it was finally abandoned, and it was named after the team's more or less founding owner, a man named Charles Comiskey. Throughout most of their history, the White Sox have sort of been the stepchildren here in Chicago, even though the crosstown Cubs have set records for its futility as well. The White Sox, perhaps some believe, were even cursed because of what happened in 1919. They did win one World Series some years back. For the most part, though, the team has not been very good. But at the turn of the 20th century, though, they were one of the most dominant teams in baseball, thanks in large measure to Charles Comiskey. In October 1919, the American League champion Chicago White Sox faced the National League champion Cincinnati Reds in the 16th edition of the World Series. It ranks as the most infamous World Series in Major League Baseball history, and one of the biggest scandals in the history of American professional sports, and one of the few sports scandals that have crossed over into actual crimes. Although most World Series have been the best-of-7 format, the 1919 World Series was a best-of-9 series, both to increase the popularity of the sport and to generate more revenue. Well, you might notice I'm wearing all black today for several reasons. First, I find black a very slimming color, and I enjoy it. And also because it happened to be in my closet at the time I decided to do this. But the other reason is because, well, two other reasons actually. One is because, although you can't see them now, the black is the official color of the White Sox nowadays. But also because the 1919 World Series and the scandal associated with it, which the White Sox threw to the Cincinnati Reds, has become known by the euphemistically, racially insensitive term, the Black Sox Scandal. In 1919, Major League Baseball was segregated. No African American men had been allowed in the majors since Fleetwood Walker played in the 1880s. And no blacks would play Major League Baseball until Jackie Robinson's debut with the Brooklyn Dodgers in 1947. While Major League Baseball was very popular but beset by scandal, the Negro National League, founded mainly by pioneer executive and future Hall of Famer Rube Foster, began in 1920 and thrived for the next 3 decades. Before Major League Baseball became entrenched as a sole repository of professional baseball for white players, there were several professional baseball leagues competing for talented players in the late 19th century and early 20th century. Most of the players were white, but there were a few African American players who played for short periods. I don't know the age demographic of the people that are watching this, but a lot of people, once they get some age on them, like people in my age bracket, they talk about sports back in their day as if it were pure, incorruptible, and the so-called good old days of sports, baseball included, when players played for the sheer joy of the game. The people who make those claims about the good old days don't know about the 1919 World Series. Charles Comiskey, the owner of the Chicago White Sox and a prominent professional baseball player from 1882 to 1894, was widely resented by his players for his cheapness. As a player, Comiskey was involved with labor organizing efforts and had taken part in a player labor rebellion in 1890. but as an owner, he had a reputation for underpaying his players, even though they were one of the top teams in the league and had already won the 1917 World Series. Some say that the White Sox were already known as the Black Sox before the label was applied to the 1919 World Series scandal, though the label had nothing to do with gambling. During spring training one year, Charles Comiskey insisted that the players pay for the laundering of their uniforms. When they refused to pay, they played in dirty uniforms and were labeled the Black Sox or the Dirty Sox. Comiskey relented and agreed to pay for the laundering, but he took the money from their salaries. But there was little the disgruntled players could do. Free agency, as now known, did not come about until the 1970s. Because of baseball's hated reserve clause, any player who refused to accept a contract was prohibited from playing baseball with any other professional team under the auspices of organized baseball. Players could only change teams with permission from their current team, and without a union, the players had no bargaining power. Comiskey was probably no worse than most owners of the time. In fact, the White Sox had the largest team payroll in 1919. Since players were not nearly as well paid in the early 20th century as they would be in subsequent decades, many players supplemented their income with jobs in the off-season, and a few did so through gambling. It wasn't difficult for gamblers to find players looking for extra cash. By 1919, gambling among players and managers was nothing new. In fact, professional baseball witnessed its first major gambling scandal in the 1860s, just as baseball was becoming professional. The first known fixed game in baseball history took place on September 28, 1865, just months after the Civil War ended. 3 players on the Mutual Club of New York were bribed $100 apiece to throw a game against the Eckford Club of Brooklyn. They were banned by the National Association of Baseball Players, but later reinstated. In 1877, 4 members of the Louisville Grays were caught throwing games at the behest of gamblers. The players, Bill Craver, Jim Devlin, George Hall, and Al Nichols, were banned from professional baseball for life, and the Louisville Grays franchise folded. Players and managers and others associated with baseball at the turn of the 20th century, it was an open secret, more or less, and sometimes not even a secret, it was just plain out open, that those individuals betted on baseball games. And it was also well known that they betted on their own games, on their own team. While that was seen with not exactly right, but with a wink and a nod, what was unacceptable was players gambling to lose a game. But that went on as well. Although the leagues enacted stricter policies on gambling after the Louisville scandal, gambling among players and managers thrived under the radar for the next several decades. Team executives, with the help of complicit sports writers, kept gambling under wraps, especially in cases where players either bet on other teams or betted on their own team to win. Just as sophisticated gambling apps do today, gamblers back in that era would not only vote on the outcome of a game, they would vote on whether a guy was going to steal a base, or whether a batter was going to get a hit, or how many errors might be made, that type of thing. Except there was no sophistication. Gamblers would simply gather at a certain point just inside or outside the ballpark and make their bets that way. One of the factors that may have given rise to this 1919 World Series scandal, along with other gambling scandals, was the fact that Major League Baseball really had weak leadership. The real power, unlike today, resided in the presidents of the respective leagues, the National League, the American League. And so that prevented any action above that level to stop scandals like this. In 1905, after the Philadelphia Athletics had clinched the AL pennant, star pitcher and future Hall of Famer Rube Waddell suffered a suspicious late-season injury and missed the series against the New York Giants. The official story was that Waddell injured his left shoulder in a playful wrestling match with a teammate, but rumors have long persisted that he was bribed by gamblers and may have faked the injury. The 1912, 1914, and 1918 World Series were beset with suspicions of gambling to throw the series. John McGraw, one of the most successful managers in baseball history, was known to bet on his own team, the New York Giants. In 1919, 2 of the game's greatest players, future Hall of Famers Tris Speaker and Ty Cobb, were caught colluding with gamblers to fix the outcome of games. Neither player was punished. So 8 members of the Chicago White Sox team of 1919 conspired with gambling interests to throw the World Series. Was this new to baseball? Not at all. It was even suspected that there was some not so well doings in the 1918 World Series, but it was a well-known fact that baseball had been beset by gambling ever since its inception, really as a professional sport, going back to the 1870s. One of the poster children for escapades of gambling at the turn of the 20th century was a man named Hal Chase, who also figures into this scandal we're talking about now, even though he was not part of the team that threw the World Series. Hal Chase was the crown prince, the poster boy for corruption in baseball in the early 20th century. Chase was an outstanding first baseman and a manager for several big league teams during the first 2 decades of the 20th century, but he was often suspected of intentional substandard play to throw games, which culminated in his being fired from the Cincinnati Reds in 1918 by manager and future Hall of Famer Christy Mathewson. Gambling allegations followed Chase wherever he went, both before and after the 1919 World Series scandal. But it took the 1919 World Series to blow the lid off gambling in baseball. Well, who were the 8 players involved in the 1919 World Series, throwing the 1919 World Series? Some of those names, one in particular, which we'll talk about a little bit later in the broadcast, have become urban legends of sort. But what about the players who were not involved in throwing the World Series? After all, there are only 8 players that conspired to do this. 2 of the most sort of outspoken and well-known players that were not involved in the scandal were second baseman Eddie Collins, who was a future Hall of Famer at the time, and a catcher named Ray Shaw. The Chicago White Sox clubhouse was divided into 2 factions. The 2 factions rarely spoke to each other on or off the field. The only thing they had in common was resentment of Charles Comiskey. One group included the more straight-laced players, later called the Clean Sox, including the 2 just mentioned, that being future Hall of Fame second baseman and Ivy League graduate Eddie Collins, whom the other infielders refused to throw to during warm-ups, and catcher Ray Shaw. 2 other players in the Clean faction were pitchers Red Faber and Dickie Kerr. Let's take a look at the 8 players involved in the scandal, starting with third baseman, a guy named Buck Weaver. Buck Weaver was the team's third baseman and one of the best defensive third basemen in the game. How much money he actually received is a question unanswered, but there seemed little doubt that he was in on the fix. Supposedly, it was Weaver who insisted that some of the money be given up front. I think even the most casual baseball fan would recognize that if a pitcher is not on board with throwing the game, it's probably not going to happen. In this case, the White Sox had 2 pitchers who were up to the neck in the scandal. One was the pitcher who started the first game of the World Series, a guy named Eddie Cicotte. Eddie Cicotte was one of the best pitchers of his era. Before he was banished, the 35-year-old Michigan native racked up Hall of Fame credentials, winning 209 games and leading the American League in wins for 2 seasons. He pitched in 3 games in the series, winning 1 and losing 2. The other pitcher involved in the scandal was a pitcher named Lefty Williams. Claude Preston Lefty Williams was a Missouri native who had spent the 1910s with 2 teams, the Detroit Tigers and the White Sox. Although he did not accrue the impressive stats that Cicotte did, he was a key figure in the White Sox success in 1919, as well as their World Series victory in 1917. The Gang of 8 also included first baseman Chick Gandil, shortstop Swede Risberg, outfielder Happy Felch, backup infielder Fred McMullen, and one of the greatest hitters in baseball history, South Carolina native Joseph Jefferson Jackson, who acquired the nickname Shoeless Joe when he was once seen playing in his bare feet when new shoes were too tight. Jackson could neither read nor write, but he could hit. He used a 48-ounce bat called Black Betsy, so called because it was coated with several layers of his own tobacco juice. Ty Cobb, the greatest player of the dead ball era of the early 20th century, called Jackson the greatest natural hitter he ever saw. One player said, "Blindfold me. I can still tell when it's Jackson that gets a hit. His bat had that special crack." Much of what happened in the fall of 1919 remains a mystery and the subject of dispute. On September 18, 1919, White Sox first baseman Chick Gandil, who has been described as a professional malcontent, met with Joe Sport Sullivan, a Boston bookmaker, at the Hotel Buckminster near Fenway Park. Gandil had gambled on baseball before, and he knew the end of his career was approaching, and he wanted to make one last big score before leaving the game. Scandal and Sullivan discussed plans to throw their upcoming series with the Cincinnati Reds. The exact amount discussed is unknown, but was believed to be about $80,000, which is about $1.4 million today. 2 days later, a meeting of White Sox players, including those committed to going ahead and those just ready to listen, took place in Scandal's room at the Ansonia Hotel in New York City. Third baseman Buck Weaver was the only player to attend the meetings who did not receive money. Nevertheless, he was later banned along with the others for knowing about the fix but not reporting it. Although he hardly played in the series, utility infielder Fred McMullen heard about the fix and threatened to report the others unless he was in on the payoff. By coincidence, McMullen was a former teammate of William Sleepy Bill Burns, a gambler who had a minor role in the fix. Shoeless Joe Jackson was mentioned as a participant, but did not attend the meetings. Although his involvement has been the subject of debate by romantic revisionist historians, and he has been the object of pity over the decades, the truth is that Jackson was fully involved in the scandal and very aware of what he was doing. The scheme got an unexpected boost when pitcher Red Faber, who was not part of the conspiracy, could not pitch in the opening game due to getting sick with the flu. Years later, catcher and fellow non-conspirator Ray Schalk said the fix would not have happened if Faber had been available. According to Schalk, since Faber was the ace of the staff, he would almost certainly have gotten starts that went instead to two of the alleged conspirators, Eddie Saccott and Lefty Williams. Well, I clap my hands here since I'm being told to. But there were supposedly 8 players involved in throwing the World Series. One of the interesting things about the 1919 World Series was that there are so many gaps and mysteries surrounding the event to this day. There are a lot of things that actually happen and some things that are urban legends which never actually happened. But one thing that should be noted, though, was the fact that in the 1919 World Series, this is before the days of the internet, before the days of television, even before the days when games were broadcast on radio. And so there was no real public glare about what happened at a game. You didn't have constant replays and things of that nature. The fans, the only ones who saw what happened were the fans who were actually at the game, as well as the sports writers, broadcasters, and of course the players themselves. And so if a scandal was going on, there was no way the average fans could see it, unlike nowadays when all the games are on television and so forth. So this is going on sort of, again, kind of hiding in plain sight. As the 1919 World Series approached, those close to the game knew that something wasn't right. Something was in the air that made this not pass the smell test, if you will. And one of the things that caused those rumors was the higher than normal amount of betting that was supposedly going on surrounding the series. Who were some of the people that were involved in discovering what was going on, unearthing what was going on, publicizing what was going on? You have to remember that even sports writers who suspected something was not right with the White Sox had to be careful what they said. For one thing, in those days, there was no real independence between the writers and the clubs, because very often the expenses that were incurred by sports writers for newspapers, etc., those expenses were typically covered by the team they were covering. So it was in their interest to not say anything that would be detrimental to their team, such as the case of the White Sox. But a few people, famous sports writers of their day who were covering the World Series, who might not otherwise cover the White Sox, including men like Ring Lardner, Hugh Fullerton, and a former baseball great named Christy Mathewson, were key in uncovering what went on in the 1919 World Series. By October 1st, the day of Game 1, rumors of a fix had reached the press box, where several correspondents, including Hugh Fullerton of the Chicago Herald and Examiner, and ex-player and manager Christy Mathewson, decided to compare notes on any plays and players that they felt were questionable. But most unsuspecting fans and observers were taking the series at face value. Eddie Saccott was a starting pitcher for the White Sox. By some accounts, Saccott had lost his nerve and was having second thoughts just days before the series began. By those same accounts, gamblers threatened to harm his wife if he reneged. One urban legend is that Saccott hit the first batter of the game as a signal that the fix was in.
That is probably not true. All involved knew the fix was a go. In the fourth inning, Sakat made a bad throw to Swede Risberg at second base. Sports writers found the unsuccessful double play to be suspicious. The White Sox lost the first game. One mistake the gamblers made was not allowing the White Sox to win the first game or two, which would have driven the odds of them winning much higher and allowed the gamblers to make more money. Lefty Williams, the other White Sox pitcher, lost 3 games, a World Series record until the 1980s. Dickie Kerr, a rookie who was not part of the fix, won both of his starts, but the gamblers were suspected of reneging on their promised progress payments, that is to be paid after each game lost, claiming that all the money was let out on bets and was in the hands of the bookmakers.
Another interesting thing about this scandal that raises a lot of questions is the fact that so many of the offensive players, this excludes the 2 pitchers, had very good series, at least at the plate. The batting averages were very high. And so this has led some to cast doubt whether or not they actually participated. But the scandalous behavior did not come at the plate. It came on the field.
By this time, many baseball insiders were certain that all was not on the up and up with the White Sox. While traveling with the team by railroad car, sports writer Ring Lardner, one of the journalists who doggedly pursued the scandal, intentionally irritated and provoked the Sox players, walking by the conspirators and singing, "I'm forever blowing ball games, pretty ball games in the air." By some accounts, after Game 5, angry about the non-payment of promised money, the players involved in the fix attempted to double-cross the gamblers and then won Games 6 and 7 of the best-of-9 series. But Lefty Williams started Game 8 and gave up 4 straight one-out hits for 3 runs before manager Kid Gleason relieved him. During the Sox' poor play, Gleason is reported to have been confused about his team, saying, "The bunch I have now couldn't beat a high school team." The White Sox lost Game 8 and the series on October 9, 1919. Besides Buck Weaver, the players involved in the scandal supposedly received $5,000 each, that's about $91,000 today, with Chet Gandil taking $35,000 or about $635,000 today. But none of those figures are certain. While rumors of a fix floated around baseball circles for the next several months after the series ended, it was not until September the following year that a Cook County grand jury convened to investigate. Eddie Sakat confessed to the grand jury on September 28th. The other conspirators were named as well, and some, including Shoeless Joe Jackson, confessed as well. As the 1920 season was ending and the White Sox were battling the Cleveland Indians for the pennant, White Sox owner Charles Comiskey felt he had no choice but to suspend the 7 players who were still on the team. One of the conspirators, the ringleader, Chet Gandil, had left the White Sox and was playing semi-pro ball in California.
You know what's interesting? How many worldwide scandals or events or even wars or political rivalries are purely the pure motivator is the fact that 2 or 3 people just personally don't like each other, not for any ideological reasons or anything like that. That was partly the case here with the 1919 World Series. Charles Comiskey, the owner of the White Sox, a former player himself, and now by then characterized as one of the league's most parsimonious, that means cheap owners, who was not kind to his players at all, by the way. At one time, he and American League President Van Johnson were very fast friends. And it's unclear exactly where the falling out how it came about, but it really happened. And had it not been for the rivalry between these 2 men, the personal rivalry, chances are this scandal may have never been discovered.
Had Charles Comiskey had his way, the scandal might have ended there, seen as an internal team matter that he resolved himself by suspending his players. But American League President Van Johnson hated Charles Comiskey and was determined to expose him to as much ridicule and strip him of as much power as possible, even though doing so would result in Johnson having to relinquish some of his own power in the end. Along with determined sports writers like Hugh Fullerton, Ring Lardner, and some private detective work, the hunt was on.
So little by little, the scandal was made public, and the 8 men who were accused of throwing the World Series were indicted by a grand jury here in Cook County and put on trial. One of the questions that's begged by looking at this is, what crime, if any, was actually committed here?
On October 22nd, 1920, just over 1 year after the 1919 World Series ended, A Cook County grand jury, led by prosecutor Charles Gorman, indicted 8 White Sox players and 5 gamblers. The indictments included 9 counts of conspiracy to defraud Charles Comiskey and their fellow teammates. More specifically, outfielder Shane Collins, as losing the series cost him and the other White Sox players the bonuses they would have gotten for winning the World Series. Sports gambling itself was not expressly prohibited under Illinois law. On November 12, 1920, Judge Kennesaw Mountain Landis assumed the duties of commissioner, at first holding on to his job as a federal district court judge while serving as commissioner. In addition to being friendly toward baseball owners, Judge Landis, who was named after the Civil War battlefield where his father had lost his leg, was known more for his theatrics than as a distinguished jurist. Landis's rulings were frequently overturned. He once hauled billionaire and robber baron John D. Rockefeller into court, a stunt that attracted a media frenzy. Landis levied a huge fine against Rockefeller and Standard Oil, but the fine was overturned on appeal. Once, when he sentenced an elderly man to a long prison term, the defendant implored Judge Landis, "Your Honor, I'm 72 years old. I won't live that long." Landis replied, "Well, do the best you can." The initial proposal was that Judge Landis chair a 3-man commission to run baseball, but he insisted that he and he alone serve as commissioner, with no checks or balances on his power. One of his first actions was to place the 8 indicted White Sox players on the ineligible list, suspending them from playing in the 1921 season pending the outcome of the case against them. The case took a bizarre twist reflective of the sleazy nature of those involved. Before the trial, key evidence went missing from the Cook County Courthouse, including the signed confessions of Eddie Saccott and Shoeless Joe Jackson, who subsequently recanted their confessions. Some years later, the missing confessions reappeared in the possession of Charles Comiskey's lawyer. On July 1, 1921, the prosecution announced that gambler Sleepy Bill Burns, who was under indictment for his part in the scandal, had turned state's evidence and would testify. During jury selection on July 11th, several members of the White Sox team, including manager Kid Gleason, visited the courthouse, chatting and shaking hands with the indicted ex-players. The courtroom was packed with journalists and baseball fans, including children, eager to see their heroes close up. The players were caught on camera, usually smiling and laughing. The lighthearted atmosphere and nonchalant attitude of the players was further demonstrated when they were seen publicly tickling Buck Weaver. Jury selection took several days, but on July 15th, 12 jurors were finally impaneled in the case. Trial testimony began on July 18th, 1921. While the players were still popular with many Chicagoans, White Sox owner Charles Comiskey was not. He was called to the stand and at one point became so angry at defense attorney Ben Short that he rose from the witness chair and shook his fist.
In addition to the players involved in this scandal that threw the World Series, who were some other colorful personalities associated with it? The most well-known figure outside of baseball that had a hand in this was one of the most notorious gangsters of his era, a man named Arnold "the Brain" Rothstein.
Born in New York City in 1882, Arnold Rothstein, nicknamed the Brain, was a Jewish organized crime kingpin who transformed organized crime from a thuggish activity by hoodlums into a big business run like a corporation. He was one of the most well-known organized crime figures of his time, making a fortune from racketeering, gambling, and the Prohibition era following the 1919 World Series, bootlegging. It was said that Rothstein never actually gambled on anything. He only gambled on something that was a sure thing or something he could fix. The extent of Rothstein's involvement in the 1919 World Series has been debated. By some accounts, he practically orchestrated the entire scandal, but other more reliable accounts suggest that he merely heard about the fix and got in on a good thing. Rothstein was contemptuous and dismissive of the accusations against him, claiming that he loved baseball. Privately, Rothstein was contemptuous of players and fans alike, who to him were all saps and suckers ripe for the picking. The most explosive testimony came on July 19th, when Sleepy Bill Burns admitted that members of the White Sox had intentionally fixed the 1919 World Series. Burns mentioned the involvement of Arnold Rothstein, among others, and testified that Eddie Saccott had threatened to throw the ball clear out of the park if needed to lose a game. After additional testimony and evidence, On July 28th, the defense rested, and the case went to the jury. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning verdicts of not guilty on all charges for all of the accused players. There were several factors that led to the acquittals. One was Eddie Saccott and Joe Jackson's missing confessions. 2, the Chicago public was simply enamored with their baseball heroes. 3rd, there was an undercurrent of ethnic prejudice against some of the gamblers associated with the scandal. And the defense succeeded in portraying the White Sox players as victims, innocent, naive, gullible small-town boys. News outlets mentioned the thick-lipped, big-nosed, sleazy gambling elements from New York City, referring specifically to men like Arnold Rothstein and generally to Jewish gamblers and gangsters.
So the 8 players were found not guilty. What was the aftermath of the scandal? A few things. First off, it was decided that Major League Baseball needed to be cleaned up and needed stronger leadership. And that's where a man named Kennesaw Mountain Landis comes into play. Kennesaw Mountain Landis was a federal district court judge, and he attended a lot of baseball games, and it said that humorist Will Rogers wrote of Judge Landis that, well, who were going to make commissioner? And every game they would look down and see this old man sitting in the stands, and they said, let's make him the commissioner. The owners of the baseball teams were thrilled with this choice because Landis had a friendly relationship with them that went back to some of his court rulings that were in their favor. However, Judge Landis, when he became commissioner, surprised the owners. He ruled the game as an absolute autocrat, and one of his first actions was to take action against the 8 players who had thrown the World Series, even though they were acquitted at trial.
Commissioner Landis, who as a judge understood that an acquittal is far different from proof of innocence, was unimpressed with the not guilty verdict. On August 3, 1921, just after the acquittals, Landis issued his own verdict. Regardless of the verdict of juries, no player who throws a ball game, no player who undertakes or promises to throw a ball game, no player who sits in confidence with a bunch of crooked ball players and gamblers where the ways and means of throwing a game are discussed and does not promptly tell his club about it will ever play professional baseball. A widely circulated photo of the 8 band players was circulated with the caption, "Fix these faces in your memory. These are the men who committed the astounding and contemptible act of throwing the World Series." Besides the 8 White Sox, 2 other players were banned, including former player Hal Chase, the poster boy for corruption in baseball who facilitated the scandal, acting as a go-between with the players and the gamblers, and had been informally blackballed from baseball anyway. Also banned was Joe Gedeon, a second baseman for the St. Louis Browns. Gedeon learned about the fix from the White Sox shortstop Swede Risberg and placed bets on Cincinnati. Gedeon informed Charles Comiskey of the fix after the series to gain reward, but Commissioner Landis banned him for life along with the 8 White Sox. The Black Sox Scandal tarnished not only the White Sox, but the World Series champion Cincinnati Reds as well, putting an unofficial qualifying asterisk by their name for that year. While the White Sox were heavy favorites, the Reds players argued that they would have beaten the White Sox anyway, fix or no fix. The Reds' argument is rebutted by the fact that their 5 victories came against 2 of the crooked pitchers, Lefty Williams and Eddie Saccott, and 2 of their 3 losses came against one of the honest pitchers, Dickie Kerr. We will never know for sure.
I'm in the club level of Gate Field, and one of the great things about sitting here, in addition to the fact that compared to tickets in a lot of other stadiums, pretty inexpensive really, particularly depending on who the opposition is and so forth. But the great thing is that you can see behind me, you can see the exhibits that are tributes to some of the White Sox players that have been with this storied franchise for over a century. And interestingly enough, even though the 1919 World Series was associated with the great scandal, there are exhibits honoring some of the players in that team. Well, there's another person who figured prominently in this, even though he was not one of the people who participated in the scandal of throwing the World Series, was the team's owner, Charles Comiskey, and he is honored here as well.
Charles Comiskey maintained ownership of the White Sox until his death in 1931. He was one of the earliest inductees into the Baseball Hall of Fame, being inducted posthumously in 1939. His legacy among baseball historians is mixed. Arnold Chick Gandil, the first baseman and ringleader, in a 1956 Sports Illustrated article, expressed remorse for the scheme. Still, he wrote that the players had abandoned the scheme when it became apparent that they would be watched closely. According to Gandil, the players' numerous errors resulted from fear of being watched, but he conceded that the players deserved to be banned just for talking to the gamblers. Gandil lived in California and worked as a plumber. He died in 1970. Eddie Saccott, the pitcher who confessed to the grand jury and later recanted, moved to Michigan, where he worked for Ford Motor Company and as a farmer and a game warden until his death in 1969. Center fielder Oscar Happy Felsch played amateur and semi-pro ball in Montana and Canada for 15 years before working as a grocer and bartender in Milwaukee. Felsch died in 1964. As for Fred McMullen, his role as team scout may have made more impact on the fix since he saw minimal playing time in the series. He never spoke publicly about the scandal and worked in law enforcement and as a process server in California. He died in 1952. Shortstop Charles Swede Risberg was Gandil's assistant and the muscle of the playing group. He went 2 for 25 at the plate and committed 4 errors in the series. After the ban, he continued playing semi-pro ball. He worked in a variety of jobs, eventually having to have his leg amputated from a baseball wound that never healed. He died in 1975. George Buck Weaver, third baseman. In an interview in 1956, Gandil said that it was Weaver's idea to get the money up front from the gamblers. Landis banished Weaver on this basis, stating men associating with crooks and gamblers could expect no leniency. Weaver and Joe Jackson successfully sued Charles Comiskey for their 1921 salaries, but the presiding judge set the verdict aside. In 1922, Weaver unsuccessfully applied for reinstatement. Like Jackson, he continued to profess his innocence to successful baseball commissioners to no effect. He unsuccessfully applied for reinstatement several more times. He died in 1956. Pitcher Claude Lefty Williams went 0 for 3 with a disastrous 6.63 ERA for the series. Only one other pitcher in baseball history, reliever George Frazier of the 1981 New York Yankees, has ever lost 3 games in one World Series. Williams died in 1959 after years of alcohol abuse. Shoeless Joe Jackson, the star outfielder and one of the best hitters in the game, confessed in sworn grand jury testimony to having accepted $5,000 in cash from the gamblers. It was also Jackson's sworn testimony that he never met or spoke to any of the gamblers and was only told about the fix through conversations with other Sox players. The other participants informed Jackson that he would receive $20,000 cash divided in equal payments after each loss. Jackson testified that he played to win the entire series and did nothing on the field to throw any of the games in any way. His roommate, pitcher Lefty Williams, brought $5,000 cash to their hotel room after losing Game 4 and threw it down as they were packing to travel to Cincinnati. This was the only money that Jackson received at any time. When his wife heard of the scheme, she told Joe Jackson it was an awful thing to do. The extent of Jackson's part in the scheme remains controversial. He had a series-leading .375 batting average, including the series' only home run in an era when home runs were rare. He threw out 5 base runners and handled 30 chances in the outfield with no errors. One play has been subjected to scrutiny. In the 5th inning of Game 4, with a Cincinnati player on second, Jackson fielded a single hit to left field and threw home, which was cut off by Saccott. Gandil, another leader of the fix, later admitted to yelling at Saccott to intercept the throw. The run scored and the Sox lost 2-0. Saccott, whose guilt is undisputed, made 2 errors in that 5th inning alone. But by some accounts, Jackson, while not actually committing errors, slowed up on balls that he could have caught. To revisionist historians and filmmakers, Jackson has become a tragic figure, a simple man who could not comprehend what he was involved in. While it is true that Jackson was illiterate and had practically no formal education, he was not the simple, ignorant rube often portrayed. Jackson admitted his guilt, but simply beat the rap. In later years, Jackson parsed words like an artful politician, saying, "When I walked out of Judge Deaver's courtroom in Chicago in 1921, I turned my back completely on the World Series of 1919. the Chicago White Sox, and the major leagues. I had been acquitted by a 12-man jury in a civil court of all charges, and I was an innocent man in the records. It was as if he had never confessed to the grand jury and to his wife, who witnessed the money being delivered to him. One of the most famous statements that stemmed from the scandal, one that is probably apocryphal and didn't really happen, was of a little boy who, having learned of the scandal, innocently said to Jackson, "Say it ain't so, Joe."
Sad footnote to some of the players involved in this scandal, particularly Shoeless Joe Jackson. After he was banned from baseball, he returned to his home, Greenville, South Carolina, and supposedly played what was called outlaw baseball under pseudonyms or aliases for several years before he retired and ran a liquor store in his hometown in Greenville, South Carolina. Once, by pure chance, one of his old rivals on the field, a player named Ty Cobb, one of the greatest players to ever play the game, by coincidence happened to walk into Jackson's liquor store.
At first, Jackson did not seem to recognize the phenomenal baseball talent known as the Georgia Peach. Cobb said to Jackson, "Don't you know me, Joe?" Jackson replied, "Sure, I know you, Ty. I just didn't think anybody up there would want to know me." Jackson died in 1951. Arnold Rothstein died a death befitting the mobster and gambler he was. In New York City in November 1928, Rothstein was shot, reportedly after refusing to pay a gambling debt. Even on his deathbed, he refused to name his assailant. No one was convicted of his murder. With 7 of their best players permanently sidelined, the White Sox crashed into 7th place in 1921 and would not be a factor in the pennant race again until 1936, 5 years after Comiskey's death. They would not win another American League championship until 1959, nor another World Series until 2005, prompting some to comment about a curse of the Black Sox. In 2024, the White Sox won only 25% of their games, the worst record of any Major League team in over 60 years. The 1919 World Series has become part of American cultural lore and has been the subject of many books and films. Elliot Asanoff's book, 8 Men Out, The Black Sox of the 1919 World Series, is one of the best-known accounts of the scandal. Asanoff's book was made into a 1988 feature film which starred John Cusack, Charlie Sheen, and David Strathairn. In F. Scott Fitzgerald's novel The Great Gatsby, a minor character named Maya Wolfsheim was said to have helped the Black Sox scandal, though this is purely fictional. The character was based on Arnold Rothstein. W.P. Kinsella's novel Shoeless Joe is a story of an Iowa farmer named Ray Kinsella who builds a baseball field in the cornfield after hearing a mysterious voice. The novel was adapted to the 1989 hit film Field of Dreams. In the film, Kevin Costner, who portrays Ray Kinsella, promotes the myth that Shoeless Joe was innocent. Shoeless Joe Jackson, portrayed by Ray Liotta, plays a central role in inspiring Ray Kinsella to reconcile with his deceased father. "If you build it, they will come," is a quote often associated with Field of Dreams. Bernard Malamud's 1952 novel The Natural and his 1984 film adaptation with Robert Redford were inspired significantly by the 1919 scandal. In the 1974 film The Godfather Part 2, the fictional gangster Hyman Roth, based on real-life gangster Meyer Lansky, alludes to the scandal when he says, "I've loved baseball ever since Arnold Rothstein fixed the World Series in 1919. The scandal is also part of the plot in several episodes of the TV series Boardwalk Empire.
Well, one of the things that motivated me to do this particular topic for our podcast is not only because I have some connections here in Chicago that I come visit every so often, and I love the city, by the way, but also because anyone knows that in recent years, a strange thing, at least I think it's a strange thing, has happened in the world of sports, and that's the proliferation of legalized gambling. And Major League Sports, baseball included, more or less sanctioning, not more or less, but actually sanctioning, getting involved with legalized gambling apps and websites and things of that nature. And for so many years, for say 100 years plus, Major League Baseball and other sports as well have done their best to distance themselves from gambling operations, and now they're pretty much in bed with it.
On May 13, 2025, Major League Baseball Commissioner Rob Manfred reinstated the Black Sox, along with several other deceased players, most notably Pete Rose, baseball's career hits leader who was banned for gambling while serving as manager of the Cincinnati Reds in the 1980s. Pete Rose passed away on September 30th, 2024. The reinstatement made Rose and the other banned players, including the two best from that group, Joe Jackson and Eddie Saccott, eligible for posthumous Hall of Fame induction.
Well, I hope you enjoyed this edition of Crime Chronicles. As we delve into the darker side of human nature, we invite you to join us on our journey by liking and subscribing to our YouTube channel. Your support helps make possible our inquiry into the sometimes unsettling but always fascinating phenomenon known as crime and justice. So hit that like and subscribe button right now and don't miss future episodes. Till then, Mark Jones, hoping you will join our Crime Chronicles community. And thanks for tuning in.